Okay, if you've seen the title of this video, then you'll know that I think Aquadome is an S tier map. And in this video, I'm going to try to explain a bit about why I feel that way and do it some justice. In general, I think Aquadome is a map that doesn't get enough love. But before I get into it, I'd like to make a few things clear. First of all, when I say Aquadome is an S tier map, I'm speaking comparatively. That means that I don't think an S tier map means it's the best map that can possibly exist, but just compared to other maps, it is one of the best maps. Secondly, for the sake of the video, I'll be recording most of this on maximum settings just to do the map enough justice, but when it's important, I might decrease the settings and all this is kind of off script, so we'll see what happens. And number 3, I think I'm mostly approaching this from a competitive sense. I don't really care about the aesthetics of maps too much for the sake of this video. And I think Aquadome does a lot of things in a competitive sense very well. I think it's a very good map for a competitive game. And I think in comparison to other maps, it's a lot better. I think there are a lot of bad maps in Rocket League and a lot of new maps are bad as well for different reasons. And so I'm trying to shine a light on the things that Aquadome does very well in a hope to then reflect on some of the things that other beloved maps or most competitive maps do poorly in comparison. Alright, so without further ado, let's go into Aquadome. First things first about Aquadome that I want to speak about, that is probably one of my favorite things about it, is the walls on Aquadome. Now, this might seem like a small thing, but in Aquadome, the walls are completely transparent. If I go onto the wall here, there's no indication that there's anything in the way at all. It just seems as if I'm just driving normally. And I really appreciate this, and other maps just seem to always have something in the way. Some texture, some shader, there's always something. And I'm going to provide a bit of a counterexample for this. But before I go into that, I want to also talk about the way that the walls and the ceiling in Aquadome are sort of sectored off, and I think that is a really big competitive thing as well. So if you look at Aquadome, the walls are kind of broken off into segments. So we have a sort of one square here, which I'll drive along, as you can see. So if you see that on the wall, it's sort of broken off into that segment. And it's the same thing on the ceiling. If you look around, you have these sort of segments. Now, I think this is actually a really important thing that a lot of people don't pay enough attention to. I think it helps with depth perception. When you see the ball traveling towards the wall, having little sectors in your mind, like this, or sectors that you can see, help to visualize where that ball is going to bounce off and where it might land relative to the wall beneath it. Once you've played the game for a long time, obviously, it's very easy to just do things based off muscle memory, but I do think this stuff still helps, especially for the ceiling. If you're in a competitive threes game and you see the ball flying up towards the ceiling, and you can see it somewhere around this area, I genuinely think that helps your brain to segment where that ball is, where it's going to bounce, and how it's going to come down. Unfortunately, it does result in a few things being somewhat in the way, although I don't find them too distracting. I do think these should be completely transparent when viewing them from outside the map. But otherwise, I think Aquadome actually does this really well. Now, I'm going to provide a counterexample here, so give me a second to find a map. Okay, so I'm on the map Wasteland here, and this is going to provide the counterexample to what I was speaking about earlier. Now, if you look on the walls on this map, you have this sort of grate in the way. There's this gate, this chicken fence, this wire, whatever you want to call it. And it seems like a small thing, but for whatever biological reason, having this in the way breaks up my brain's ability to clearly make out the image behind it. Of course, I can see through it. It's not like suddenly there's something completely in the way. But it makes it harder for my brain to completely visualize and put everything together. And besides that, it's just distracting. I find this really bothersome, and I don't really understand why most maps are like this. To my knowledge, I could be wrong about this, and it doesn't really matter if I am, but Aquadome is the only map I can think of that doesn't have some sort of texture or shader in the way when you're driving around. And as you can see, the segmentation on the walls here is just inferior as well. Of course, you have these sort of these hexagonal arrangements. I think they're hexagonal. Yeah, these hexagonal arrangements on the wall. And that is sort of breaking up the wall in some way. But I really think it's just inferior, right? There's just too much going on. There's a lot of visual noise everywhere. Especially with there's a lot of things in the background as well going off, which is probably reduced on lower settings anyway. But I just wanted to highlight this. This is a really annoying thing. And there are a lot of maps that people actually like as well that really have this issue. So if I think Beckwith Park is quite bad for this as well. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those optical illusions where they have like lots of small squares and you look at them and your eyes kind of go a bit funny. That's kind of what I'm referring to when I say that, you know, for some biological reason it breaks up your brain's ability to discern things properly. So you can see on the wall here as well, there's just all this garbage in the way. And the worst thing about all this being in the way as well is that it doesn't have to be there. It doesn't do anything. All it does is provide some sort of, I guess, cohesion to the environment. Like it looks like a metal gate of some sort. But in terms of gameplay, it does nothing. It only detracts from the game. Even just driving along here, it's just distracting. And maybe it's just me, but every time I'm playing and I come up on the wall on one of these maps, I find this immediately slightly distracting. It catches my attention just for a split second. And I totally understand if people want to say I'm just being pedantic, it really doesn't matter or something, but personally, I find this very annoying. I hate it. And it's on every new map as well. Some maps are worse than others in this regard, but Aquadome is one map that doesn't do that at all, and it's an old map as well, so it's an old map that got this right. Okay, back on Aquadome, and another thing that I think Aquadome does very well that other maps seem to do very poorly, and this is something that bothers me a lot in many maps, is something I'll refer to as the boost pad contrast ratio. Now, it's a bit of a nebulous term, so to explain what that means, I'm referring to how visible the small boost pads are on the ground compared to the ground itself. Now, it might be a bit difficult to see with a 1080p video, and it's going to be compressed by YouTube, so I'll stay in front here just to keep it as obvious as possible. But just looking here, I don't have a huge monitor. Most competitive monitors are quite small as well, but I can see many different boost pads immediately. And I think when you're playing a very fast game like Rocket League, it's really important that you can see boost pads very, very quickly. Of course, as a long-time player, I do have a good sense of where boost pads tend to be without needing to see them. But I really do think that when you're driving around and you're trying to work on boost efficiency, just seeing some boost pads pop up in the corner of your eye, your periphery, or just being able to make out boost lines like this, I think that's really important. I think it's really important to be able to see that stuff very clearly. And I'm going to turn anti-aliasing off for a second and bloom just to turn off motion blur and depth of field, because this is sort of, what I play with or what I'm used to. And having anti-aliasing off makes it difficult to see things in the distance a bit more, but you can just see here, I can see all the boost pads all the way at the back. So from here, I can see this boost pad all the way over there. And again, when you're playing, I think split-second decisions are really important. If I've got ball cam off and I need to check where boost pads are around me because I'm looking for boost, I want that process to be done as quickly as possible. And I think on maps where you have to spend a lot longer doing that, I think it's a problem. I'm not against boost recolors as well. It might harm the identity of the game a little bit, but I'm not opposed to the idea of different maps having different color boost to help differentiate it, because otherwise all the maps are going to look the same with a sort of like dark ground. Now, again, I understand some of you might say this is kind of nitpicky, but the thing is, it doesn't need to be like this. Well, it doesn't need to be bad. And Psyonix, or whoever is creating the maps, seem to have fallen into a really bad habit where lots of maps that come out have really poor boost contrast ratios. I'm being totally genuine when I say it blows my mind that so many maps are released that have orange boost on them and orange grounds. It's unbelievable. I'll show you some counterexamples here. Let's see if I can find just a map I can think of. Deadeye Canyon, for instance. Okay, so we're in Deadeye Canyon, and when my brain is having to scour the environment for boost pads, it's just harder. The human brain, or the human eye, however you want to look at it, is bad at kind of discerning things in terms of camouflage. It's just harder. I can see them, but my brain really has to look. If I do the same test I did with Aquadome, that far away boost pad, probably the furthest one away that's not behind the ball, it's really hard to see that. I can't immediately see it. And when I'm just driving around, collecting boosts or something, my brain immediately wants to skip over these boost pads. I even just lost track of this one because it's on orange ground and these are orange boost pads. I understand that these boost pads are on like little things that kind of help discern them, but I don't think it's enough, especially when you start looking at them in this sort of like parallax view. You can't make out things very well, and I think it's a real problem. Rocket League prides itself on its fairness as a competitive game, and I really like that about it, but having bad maps in competitive rotations you have to play on is frustrating, and you never want to feel like a map is holding you back even a tiny bit. I'm not saying maps have to be perfect. You can see there's a wall thing here as well. This is kind of egregious with the colours as well. I'm not saying maps have to be perfect, but this is such a simple, easy change that can make a lot of maps much, much better. If anyone has any data, I'd love to see the average boost amounts on certain maps. I would be willing to bet that on maps like this that have the very poor boost contrast ratio, that players on average have less boost. I found myself missing boosts on these maps for that reason, so I'd be very interested to see if that is the case. And again, even so, I don't like how much extra work I have to do for it. I can go to another map here as well. I think another very bad one is, ironically, Wasteland. I've really disliked the Wasteland map. There's visual noise everywhere because the textures and shaders make it look like the ground has some sort of depth to it. Even this boost pad just here, I can't see that, right? It's insane. Look how quickly that disappears. It's really bad. And even if I just lower all the graphical settings here completely, and we go to what, I'd usually use, it's still hard. Like, my brain has to do so much work. I know there are boost pads right in the back there, and I can't see them. And I'm not sat far away from my monitor either. I just don't understand why they keep insisting on doing this. Just to make a point of it, I just want to point out how many maps there are that are orange for some reason. You have Wasteland, you have Salty Shores, you have Deadeye Canyon, and these all have the night variations as well on a lot of them. It's just insane, and they're all in the competitive rotation as well, usually. I don't understand. If I look at Salty Shores as well here, because I think that's another bad one, because I really want to drive this home. Just please, Psyonix, whoever, please stop doing this with maps. It's so frustrating. As you can see again, it's hard to make out. Now this map, Salty Shores, actually has done something a bit better. They've made big circles around the boost pad, which is good. But then I think the Deadeye Canyon was released after Salty Shores, so it's weird to me that they've done it on Salty Shores and potentially realised it's a problem, but then they haven't on Deadeye Canyon. I don't understand why this inconsistency exists. And it does help, I can more easily visualise boost lines by looking at these little things on the ground, and that helps. And again, I really want to drive home the fact that when you're playing Rocket League or whatever competitively, you're not sat here just looking at them. You're driving around, everything is moving fast, there's a lot of visual noise, you've got the motion blur on your monitor from the response times, whatever. And it's very easy to miss out on these boost pads, it's very easy to not see them. And when you're very quickly looking at the ball and then looking away, you have a very short amount of time to get that visual information to check where the boost is to line up the boost. It's really important, I think, and it's just really poor. And Aquadome, again, is one of the best maps in this regard. If we look at a map that does this very, very well, we can look at Beckwith Park Midnight. Actually, not Beckwith Park Midnight, there is a better map for this. Neo Tokyo. You can see that on Neo Tokyo, the boost contrast ratio here is really, really, really good. It's very, very, very clear where these boost pads are. Just, again, immediately, just take a snapshot on your brain. You can just see so many boost pads immediately. And again, it's a really small thing that can be changed in the game, but just isn't for some reason. I'm sure development is very hard and everything, but at least there are standardized maps, so not too much has to go into the design of the maps in that regard. And this is just something that's very simple. Again, I don't want every map to have a dark ground, because it doesn't necessarily have to. You can change the boost color, do something, put something around them, something to highlight them at a distance, just anything you can do. And again, Aquadome does this very, very well, and I think that's an understated thing of Aquadome. Okay, back into Aquadome, and another thing that I want to point out that Aquadome does very, very well is, and again, it's a small thing, but the goalpost lining or the goalpost boundaries are very, very, very clear in Aquadome. If you just look from this distance, you can see how clear the goal boundaries are there. And the reason I think it's so clear is a clever use of lighting behind the goal, as you can see. And there is still some lighting with the graphics on minimum. But a big thing about it that I really appreciate, and I wish other maps did well, or did as well, and I think Aquadome is probably one of the best, if not the best in this regard, it's just how thin the edges of the goalpost are. It's very clearly defined. You don't have like this weird thing just by the side of it, outlining it, anything like that. As an experienced player, I think it's quite easy to have some sort of intuitive understanding for how big the goal is and, you know, whether you can shoot under or above the crossbar. But I do think having a clearer image of the goal boundaries actually helps with accuracy, I would say. Especially so when you're approaching the goal with some sort of flick and you really need to get it above or below the crossbar exactly. I really, really think that helps. I just think it's very, very clear, and it makes the goal look quite large in comparison to some other maps for whatever, you know, for whatever biological reason or, you know, illusionatory reason. Now, if I try to find another map that I think does this quite poorly. Okay, so we're on Forbidden Temple. I wouldn't say this map is the worst offender in this regard, but I do think it's still pretty bad. The reason being here is that you obviously have some sort of texture or different, you know, geometry that outlines the goal here. But what's important to understand is that the sort of red lining is not only on the outside of the goal, but it's also on the inside of the goal, as you can see here. And I hope you can understand what I mean, but when you look at the goal like this, being able to see that red underneath it as well from the top makes the goal appear either smaller or bigger than it is. And especially when you have this like red outline at the back. Again, a lot of this stuff when it comes to just your brain is split second stuff. When I look at that, the goal almost looks smaller than it is. Or the top looks like there's some sort of illusion where the top has a big border around it. My brain, for whatever reason, just sees this goal as being smaller than the one on Aquadome. It doesn't look like there's as much space to shoot. And the edges aren't as clearly defined. I'll try to see if I can find another map that does this quite poorly. In my experience, most maps do this somewhat poorly, and Aquadome is one that does it very, very well. Okay, we're everyone's favourite map, Manfields. Now this, I think this is very poor again. If you look at the goal and the goal boundaries here, the goal looks smaller than it actually is. And the reason it looks smaller is because you have this lining that's on the inside. So you can see that orange line that's going up. So when you look at the goal from this distance, it actually looks like the lining on the inside is where the goal boundaries are, so it looks smaller, but it isn't. That's not where the goal is, and it's the same thing for the top. The goal just looks a lot smaller. If you do it side by side in your own game, I think it's very clear how some goals just look smaller or they don't look as clearly defined. And the edge of the goal here also doesn't look as clearly defined on the corner. And in high-level games, it should go without saying that things are about edge cases. You really want to see exactly where your shootable opportunities are, and especially when it comes to reading bounces. Some maps can really be confusing with bounces because when it bounces off a corner, it looks like the ball comes off the wrong way. And often, it is consistent with other maps, but the reason it looks like it comes off so weird is because of the weird geometry surrounding the goals. I know some people are going to say this is just a very nitpicky thing, but it's just something that doesn't need to be done. You don't need to add these things into the middle. All they do is just make it appear worse than it is, whereas Aquadome takes a very simple, elegant solution and does it very, very well, I think, and most maps have this problem. Okay, now another thing about Aquadome that I like is, first of all, there's no visual noise outside. Now, I know that might seem like a bit of a weird thing to say because there's clearly things moving outside, but if I turn the graphical settings down here, there is actually like nothing on the outside, and anything that does appear on the outside appears very far away. Some maps have all sorts of banners and stuff behind the walls that I think affects depth perception quite badly. The designers of this map have actually done something quite clever with the walls, with how they've got this sort of like frosting or dirt effect, which allows you to have some depth perception on the walls despite them being completely transparent, which I really appreciate. I think it's a really good thing. But the other thing I want to talk about with Aquadome, and probably the last thing I'll make note of here, is the visual noise on the ground. I feel this is something that's quite hard to get right, and it's quite hard to get a feel for and explain exactly. There are markings on the ground that I guess help segment the ground up. And I think that really helps with depth perception. Whenever you're creating a 3D game, you have to deal with all sorts of problems that arise from the camera and the lack of depth perception. When we're talking about the way we view the world, in the way games work, we're not actually usually moving through that world, but items are just, or objects. Objects decrease and increase in size based on your relative position. So there's some matrix calculation, and those objects appear larger. And that works in games because that is how we view the world. If you imagine that you were walking towards something, all that's happening is that thing is getting larger with time. It's just getting larger. You're not really taking account of how close you are to it. Of course, in real life, when you move around and you change angles, you can see that you actually are moving towards it. But a lot of games take a very simplified approach with like matrices and stuff, and they just make the object larger. What I'm getting to with this is that depth perception in games is hard. It's hard in reality too. If you had something in front of you in reality and you had nothing else to help you discern depth, again, the only thing you see is how big or small that object is, and that's the only thing you can use to discern how close you are to it. Now, some maps have an awful amount of visual clutter that I think really affects the ground. I'd say it's visual noise that makes depth perception harder, and some maps have nothing on them, which, while it can look nice, and it helps with response times and stuff, it can actually be hard to perceive depth because of that. Because there's nothing to indicate where the ball is relative to the geometry itself. Now with Aquadome, you have all sorts of things on the ground. You have these sorts of segmented parts, a lot like the ceiling. You have textures, and they're not really noisy textures, they're just kind of like wide, large geometric textures. And I think when you're hitting the ball around, this actually helps you to understand where that ball is going to bounce. Of course you have the ball indicator underneath, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that this probably helps the brain in a way that is very subtle and we don't realize, and it's something I really appreciate about the map. And again, one thing that does really bother me about Aquadome and it bothers me about a lot of maps, is this kind of thing going on here. Please, if you make maps in the future, Sonics, or something we should complain about is having clutter that appears when you drive along the back. Some maps are worse offenders, some maps completely block you from seeing things, which is really frustrating. Just make the wall completely transparent, if possible. When I'm on this stretch of the wall, I can't see the wall at all, but that doesn't affect my ability to understand where I am on that wall. I really genuinely wish if you are outside the map, or the camera is outside the map looking in, then the wall itself just disappears. It might not be the most elegant solution, but I think it would work very well. One more thing I want to say about Aquadome that I think does kind of give it a bad rep is I think Aquadome is... ugly is not the word I'd use, but it's kind of gloomy and depressing in its appearance, and it's quite claustrophobic as well. I think people tend to gravitate towards maps that are fieldy, like Beckwith Park or Manfield. They feel open and free and not claustrophobic, and I genuinely feel that that really affects the way people view maps and how they enjoy them. Whereas Aquadome is kind of the opposite. It's gloomy, it uses kind of muted colours, it's quite claustrophobic, and I do think that, you know, psychologically speaking, when you play this map, you just feel a bit closed in. You feel a bit more down than you would playing a very open map like Manfield, and I do think that's a real mark on this map. I do wish the map was a bit more open. I don't want to say it's objectively bad, because it isn't. Maybe some people like dark, claustrophobic maps, but personally I do tend to prefer open maps that feel light and they feel, it's hard to use a word other than open and free. Another thing that comes to mind with Aquadome is actually the ambient levels of light. I do think Aquadome can just be a little bit dark at some points. It's quite clear that there's some sort of baked in darker texture or shader applied around the corners here in order to elucidate or illuminate the corners here. If you look at the wall here, you can see that this is dark in this area, and it's dark there, and it's lighter there. I don't know if that's some in-game actual lighting effect, or if the colors, the textures themselves, or the shaders or whatever, are just darker and lighter. It's probably the latter in order to save on performance. But sometimes Aquadome can be a tiny bit dark in areas, but overall I think the ambient light levels are very good. Now, I bring this up because there's a real problem with some maps being too dark. Some good examples of maps being too dark would be Urban Central and Urban Central Night, and Beckwith Park Midnight, and Neo Tokyo. So I'm in Urban Central Night at the moment, and when I'm playing on this map competitively, and the opponent is in, it's particularly blue cars on the blue side, and they're using like a very dark blue preset, it's really hard to see not only them quite quickly, similar with the boost pad thing, how I want to see them quickly, but it's hard to see how their car is oriented because the maps themselves are so dark. Again, it might be a nitpicky thing, but when someone's up in the air and you've just switched ball cam on and off and you see back to them, you want to very quickly be able to see how their car is oriented. But on darker maps, it's very hard to. They can blend into the background. Certain parts of this map are just very, very dark. I'm going to go to Beckwith Park Midnight to further prove that point. If you play against someone on this map with a very dark blue car, which is quite popular in the community, then I hope you understand what I mean. I don't really have any clips of this, but it's just hard to see players. And it takes my brain a significantly amount of time longer to discern the orientation of people's cars. And I think that's a problem. I think light maps are really good for that reason. And Aquadome is not a dark map. It's gloomy, but it's not dark, and I do really like that. It could be lighter, it's not like the best in that category, but it could be far darker, and I do appreciate that about Aquadome. Just a quick tip, well, one more thing I want to talk about is I'm very sensitive to light, so I tend to have my monitor on quite low brightness values, especially if I'm playing in a dark room. And that's where dark maps like Beckwith Park become a real problem. If you're watching this on your phone or your monitor, as I'm driving around Beckwith Park, put your brightness to as low as it can and you'll see how dark this map becomes, on the blue side especially. then if you imagine someone who has a black car or someone who has a dark blue car or just some sort of dark decal, it's really hard to tell what they're doing. And when you need to make a decision in a split second, having to essentially do a double take of that person and their car to understand what they're doing is a problem. It's just a problem. There's nothing more to say about it than that. And it's got a pretty simple solution. Or it should have a simple solution. Now, a little hint here is that you can actually make cars have brighter colors if you enable the colorblind mode. I'm not colorblind myself, but it's in the interface section here. Now, it doesn't really affect your car. Maybe it does, I don't know, but with opponents, if they have particularly dark orange or dark blue cars, it makes their cars lighter. I don't think it affects like black cars or anything like that. But I really wish there were a toggle in the game to force everyone to use like a bright blue or bright orange decal. I think you would get rid of this problem with dark maps almost completely, with not being able to see players' cars, and I don't understand why it's locked behind a colorblind option. I think for the sake of competitive integrity, there should just be an option to force everyone to have, default looking cars. Kind of like, think stock tank colors or something. I don't want to say it wouldn't be too much work on behalf of the devs, because I understand the game is probably very hard to develop for, especially with Unreal Engine 3. But I do think it's something that shouldn't be a monumental change, but would massively help with dark maps in my opinion, and it's something I would definitely use if I had the option to. Because right now I need to have my monitor brightness on high when playing Rocket League, just so I can deal with dark maps. Combining all those things together, I hope you guys can see why I think Aquadome is an S tier map. It does a lot of things well, and it does some things better than almost all other maps do, and it's an early map as well. I do understand Aquadome had or might have some performance problems associated with it, which really sucks, but I'm not going to add this as part of my grading for the map. Although I do see in the community that there's a lot of hate towards Aquadome. People say it's like the worst map or it's a bad map, and I don't really understand why. My guess would be most people just don't like how gloomy and claustrophobic it is, and I do kind of understand that. But I hope talking about some of these things sheds light on how maps might be better designed in the future, especially if we're going to see standardized maps constantly come out. Then I'd really like to use Aquadome as an example of how to do some things right. Anyway, I'm going to call this off here. I'm sorry for the sort of very casual, almost unedited approach, but I hope this was somewhat insightful, and I hope it starts at least a small conversation amongst some people as to how some maps should be better or could do better. In a competitive game, I don't think people should be okay with settling for things that are unacceptable or very easy changes that can make things a lot better. And again, I hope some of these small changes things Aquadome does can show just how small changes can make every map or a lot of maps a lot better. Thank you all so much. I hope the video was somewhat enjoyable to watch and somewhat insightful. Thank you for your time, and see you later.